Hey PC World fans, Adam here with Gordon. And Gordon, we're starting to see brand new 14-inch laptops, which for both you and I is kind of an interesting segment because we're seeing a lot of power in a really small chassis, right? Is that why you're excited about this?
Small, very compact, relatively light too, right? This is 4 pounds 1 ounces. That is 3 pounds 11 ounces. So pretty light, you know. And the 15-inch laptops you would normally see that in, they got kind of heavy. Those are like 5-pound laptops now. So to me, I'm excited because they're so small and so powerful.
And would you say the Asus Zephyrus G14 kind of paved that way for really small, light laptops that contained a ton of power?
Yeah, I would agree because it actually had discrete graphics, and that has been the hardest thing to get in a small, compact laptop. We've had them before, very, very compromised, very low power, but we're getting very powerful graphics now on these laptops.
Okay, well, like I said, the newest round of 14-inch laptops is here. We have 2 of them specifically on the table here. We have the Asus ZenBook Pro 14 OLED with a Core i9-13900H and a 4070. And then we also have a Razer Blade 14 with a Ryzen 9 7940HS, also with a 4070. Those are the only 2 things that are kind of common about these two, but even the 4070 isn't common because on the Asus we got 110 watt TGP, and the Razer we have 140 watt TGP.
Right.
So even though they're not the same configuration, we're not here to go apples to apples. It's just kind of, hey, 14-inch. These are a couple options that we have on us. But you also saw the Dragon Range laptop. We haven't done a video on it, but we're going to include the results here.
Right.
Tell me about the Dragon Range laptop.
So the Dragon Range is basically AMD's desktop CPU put into a laptop. Is very similar to what Intel did with its HX class CPUs, where they took desktop class CPUs, jammed them into a great big gaming laptop. So those are 17.3-inch, 6-pound laptops with 330 watt power bricks, giant, huge, and fast.
So essentially the best of the best you can get in laptop form.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Oh. Okay, so we've got some laptops in this charts. I think let's just kick it off where it always starts, and that's Cinebench. So Gordon, we're seeing Cinebench multi-threaded here. Go over these results for me.
Well, I think probably for AMD, they want to point out, by the way, our Dragon Range is faster than Intel's Core i9-13980HX. That is Intel's top-end Raptor Lake CPU in a laptop, in a great big laptop as well. More interesting to me, though, I want to see the CPUs in the 14-inch laptops. We actually see AMD's brand new Ryzen 9 7940HS versus that Core i9-13900H. That's basically 8 cores for Ryzen versus 14 cores for Intel. And no surprise in Cinebench, Intel actually wins, although it's not winning by what you would expect, because we are talking about 14 cores versus 8 physical cores in the Ryzen, and that's mostly because as you heat up that Intel chip in a smaller, thinner laptop, it's gonna back off the boost. And well, it is faster here. It's not as fast as you'd expect it to be.
Yeah, and what's the core breakdown for that Intel part? How many big cores and E-cores?
So it's 6 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores. The performance cores also have hyperthreading versus the AMD Phoenix, which is basically 8 performance cores, if you want to call it that, with SMT or AMD's version of hyperthreading.
Okay.
So
interesting. Yeah.
But still, 14 cores versus 8, you'd think it'd be a bigger beatdown, and it's not just because you heat it up. Intel chips tend to burn off some of that boost.
Okay, well, what about when we switch over to single-threaded? This is usually where Intel, once again, kind of dominates. What's the story here?
Well, it is interestingly kind of flipped around here for the 14-inch laptops. Again, typically, Intel does lead in single-threaded performance. They have, very, very high power usage and also very high clocks. When you look at the Phoenix versus the Core i9-13900H and the thinner, smaller laptops, I was kind of surprised to see the Razer Blade 14 outpace the Asus ZenBook Pro 14 OLED. AMD's a little bit ahead. I wouldn't say it's a big deal here, but for AMD, that typically is going to be slower than Intel. This is a decent win for them.
Yeah, I mean, and this is essentially big core versus big core. Not like the hyper-threading that has all the mixture of cores in there. This is big core versus big core, and AMD's big core is just better than than Intel's
Yeah.
core on that one.
No, definitely. I mean, it's right there. In fact, if you look at it, that Razer Blade 14 with that Ryzen 9 7940HS, it's right behind that older Core i9 12900HX, which was a desktop CPU, 12th gen, jammed into a great big laptop too. So yeah, you're getting very, very good single-threaded performance for AMD, which typically hasn't always been where they lead Intel, especially when you look back at Ryzen 5000 versus Ryzen 7000, right?
All right. Well, that's pretty interesting results so far. Let's move over to V-Ray, because one of the great things about these 14-inch laptops is that you can do some serious work on that, and V-Ray is definitely a serious workload. So,
Right.
what's the story here? Well, first off, I see one of the bars is missing.
Yeah,
What's up with
oddly,
that?
it did not run on the ZenBook Pro 14. I'm not really sure why. Could be drivers. I suspect it would have been faster than the Ryzen 9 7940HS and the Razer Blade 14, because 14 cores kind of generally give it more performance. We unfortunately don't know, so we get a blank there. The win, of course, though, is for the Asus ROG Strix Scar, the Dragon Range CPU, which is nearly 27,000 versus 22,000 of the Core i9 13980HX.
That's
So
definitely a bigger bar.
it's a bigger bar. One argument I've seen is in Cinebench, for some reason, Intel just simply does generally better, even though it's an all-core load over AMD. But in other all-core loads, V-Ray, you can see AMD typically win. This actually mirrors what I've seen on desktop, where a Ryzen 7000 will generally beat Intel's best Raptor Lake. In
Even though
V-Ray,
it has less cores, it has fewer cores.
fewer cores, but if you look at in Cinebench, the Intel chip, the Raptor Lake will actually generally be faster than the Ryzen. But the V-Ray pretty much backs up that in a lot of these multi-threaded tasks, actually AMD's generally the way to go.
Okay, well, speaking of another multi-threaded task, we have Blender. You've got 3 different scenarios here, and it's shorter bar better?
Bigger bars are better, and the bigger bar again is for that Dragon Range CPU, that Asus ROG Strix Scar with that Ryzen 9 7945HX. Remember, that is 16 cores versus 24 cores in that GT77HX with the Core i9 13980. Again, generally a pretty big win, especially on that heavier monster load.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost kind of mirroring what we just saw from
Right.
V-Ray. Interesting. Okay, well, let's talk about Crossmark. Remind me again, real quick, what Crossmark test?
So Crossmark is basically made by Babco. It is a synthetic benchmark. It basically uses a suite of open source applications that they write to simulate productivity, creativity, and then they also measure responsiveness, like opening files, launching applications. And then they give you a score. It actually runs on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, iOS, Android too, I believe. So
Wow.
you can run it on a lot of different platforms. Here we're only going to use it on Windows itself. And bigger bar is better. And overall, the ZenBook actually wins, but there's a couple surprises here. To me, the biggest one is that the Razer Blade actually gets a better score in responsiveness. I generally see Intel get better scores in responsiveness because, again, their higher clocks really aid them. And we can see that generally in the other Intel laptops, but actually down constrained in this 14-inch form factor with discrete GPU in there. The Razer Blade actually wins with the Phoenix processor. The nice thing for Intel, though, is they do get a pickup in creativity. I would attribute that to them simply having more cores. And I will say one thing I do like about this test is this is made by Babco. It's a test that Intel has actually said, hey, you should run Crossmark. And I started to run Crossmark because at the time, AMD says, hey, you should run Geekbench with Ryzen 7000. So I threw in Crossmark, and it's nice to see if one vendor says, I like this benchmark, and then we now see them actually losing in a sort of similar class form factor. That actually kind of says the benchmark actually may be more valid, because if AMD's doing pretty well in single-threaded performance, which generally Crossmark sort of favors, that may mean the benchmark is fair, because a lot of people will always cry like, oh, this favors one or the other. But we're seeing an example here where the Razer Blade with the Phoenix AMD CPU is actually doing better in responsiveness. And overall, I'd say it's pretty close on a lot of these.
Yeah, these numbers aren't too crazy.
Yeah.
When compared, but let's go to everyone's favorite Geekbench.
Yeah.
What does Geekbench tell us about the breakdown of these laptops?
Well, the Geekbench, of course, is a popular and somewhat controversial benchmark only because people just like to argue about it all the time. It's TM, the official benchmark of arguing on Twitter and Reddit. With as little data as you have. For multi-core, no surprise, 14 cores is more than 8 cores, and Intel gets the lead here. That Core i9-13900H having a very, very solid performance edge over the 8-core Ryzen 9 7940HS. But in single-threaded, again, look at that messaging. 2006 versus 2004. Technically, that's a win. I'd call it a tie. But single-threaded performance
but that's got to be a margin of error.
Margin of error. It's not a big deal. And what I really like is you're seeing both Ryzen 9 7940HS and the Core i9-13900H. Both have single-threaded performance slightly higher than the Razer Blade 17 and the MSI Titan GT77, which has a Core i9-12900HX. That's a desktop CPU jammed into a laptop. You're getting very decent single-threaded performance out of both platforms.
Right.
So I gotta say that's respectable, especially against very big laptops. Very big at the time, probably the fastest laptops you could get out there, and very respectable.
All right, well, let's move on to a couple of content creation tests. This is a Puget Bench Photoshop, which I'm curious about, but once again, this is typically lightly threaded, correct?
Yeah, and that's why I was very excited to see this. There's generally, again, like you're saying, very lightly threaded, very high clocks, very high IPC sort of wins here. Overall, the winners are, of course, the big, fat gaming laptops. In fact, if you look at it, the 3 longest bars here are the 17.3-inch big, heavy desktop replacement laptops. Essentially, kind of almost the same in Photoshop for the overall score. And when we're looking at the 14-inch laptops, the ZenBook Pro 14 actually pulls ahead of the Razer Blade 14 with its Ryzen 9 7940HS. Not a lot. I thought it would be a little closer, but honestly, there are still some things that favor Intel, and I would attribute the fact that it may simply favor Intel here because it depends on the compiler, it depends on the application, and Intel has a little bit of an edge. It even depends sometimes on the integrated graphics because in the past on U-class laptops, some filters that Puget Bench runs may favor the Intel graphics. So.
Okay, well, switching over to Puget Bench for Lightroom Classic, this has both a passive and an active score. Active is moving around inside the actual application and doing editing, and then passive is the actual export, which usually is multi-threaded, right?
Right.
And where active is single-threaded.
The overall winner is the GT77, that MSI Titan, with the Core i9-13980HX. The Dragon range is fairly close at 1433 versus 1558 overall. Again, this sort of shows you could call it favoritism. For somebody who uses Photoshop, they don't care, they just want more performance, but generally, a lot of Adobe products tend to favor Intel by an edge, and we may be seeing that here as a factor. And when we look at the 14-inch laptops, the ZenBook Pro 14 got a very decent lead over that Ryzen 9. The main reason, though, is a core count, I'm going to guess, because when you look at it, the active score, Intel has a slight edge on there, but when you look at that passive score, where you're basically doing that export of all the photos, the 14 cores of the Core i9-13900H has a very healthy lead over the 8 cores of the Ryzen 9 7940HS. That's not horrible for the HS part, but definitely AMD is a little bit of a core disadvantage against Intel's chips. And again, you have to give Intel credit for its pursuit of performance and E-cores, because those E-cores definitely are adding up to more performance. We see it in, we saw it in Cinebench, we're seeing it here. There's just some things where it really can help you if you're not really held down by the thermals of it.
I don't think it's just that, though, because if you look at the active score on the ZenBook Pro 14 is virtually identical to the ROG Strix Scar, which is that full desktop part. So, I mean, we're talking about, like, That's more single thread, lightly threaded
Right.
kind of stuff. So yeah, I think there definitely is some just it prefers Intel going on here. So
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely possible. I mean, generally on desktop, what we would see is, more cores help. And then also, AMD has a lot of all P cores, so that helps them as well. But, it's weird.
but it's not
We don't
helping here.
Not
No.
helping here. Because it doesn't have more cores on mobile.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's switch over to graphics. You didn't do any gaming tests, but you did do some synthetic tests.
Right.
And this was all with the discrete GPU, correct?
I didn't do any gaming here because of time constraints, but I did want to give people at least a taste for how powerful the 4070 laptop GPU is. Remember, all laptop GPUs are sized down from their desktop equivalents, but you want to know how fast they are. And we can see both of the 14-inch laptops here, both again with 4070 laptop GPUs in them. 140 watt TGP for the Razer Blade, 110 watts for the Asus ZenBook Pro. Fairly close. You can see definitely, you're going to give up a little bit of performance on that ZenBook Pro because it's limited to 110 watt TGP, but probably not as much as you expected. And then, of course, I do want to mention this is actually very interesting to me because again, TimeSpy is a synthetic benchmark. It is very repeatable. It is actually a very reliable benchmark. That's why overclockers use it. Look at the performance of the 4070 laptop GPU versus the two laptops on the bottom. Those are basically 3080 Ti laptops. One is 175 watt TGP and a great big honking huge laptop. The other one is a 3080 Ti at 165 watts at a larger but thinner laptop. Yes, it's not a real game, but honestly, this gives you a pretty good gauge of how powerful the 4070 is. You're basically getting almost the performance of a 3080 Ti at 175 watt TGP in a great big laptop. So I would say that's very decent for this 4070 series.
Pretty damn close. You also did 3D Mark Speedway. So what are the expected results in here?
So Speedway is a DirectX 12 benchmark. The biggest winners here, of course, are the big gaming laptops, the 4090s. Look, actually,
4090 laptop.
4090 laptops, yes. Otherwise, if I don't say that, people will get triggered. It is a 4090 laptop GPU. And the 4070 laptops, which I'm interested in again because I want to see how these perform. Decent. Again, you're definitely almost half the performance of a 4090 laptop GPU, but those laptop GPUs are pretty fast, and to get half that performance is pretty good. And again, let's look at the last generation of GPUs. RTX 3080 Ti 175 watt TGP, 3300 versus 2800. Yeah, it's slower, but honestly, that is awfully close. I'd be pretty uncomfortable if I were a 3080 Ti. And considering that the laptops are smaller and thinner, you have to say that the 4070 laptop GPU is pretty respectable against older generation parts in ray tracing.
Okay. Speaking of the GPU, you also did look at CUDA performance. Once again, we're missing a result here. What happened?
Yeah, it just, for some reason, V-Ray refused to run on the ZenBook Pro 14. I'm not really sure why, but I did want to run it because I, again, want to get a feel for how these laptops run, especially for things that are not gaming, because the entire world is not focused on gaming. For content creation, if you're doing rendering in CUDA, RTX, and V-Ray, it's very, very useful, especially these powerful laptops. And again, the big winners are the big fat RTX 4090 laptop GPUs. They are just smoking in CUDA and RTX. But again, I would say, look, that RTX 3080 Ti in both the big gaming laptop and the thinner gaming laptop, it is shockingly close to a much, much smaller laptop. You're basically getting almost 3080 Ti at very high wattage out of these 14-inch laptops.
Yeah. So. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. And then for the final benchmark test, you did Octane Bench. Remind me what Octane Bench is?
So Octane is a different render engine. This is basically runs only on RTX. Octane Bench is, of course, powerful if you are going to do GPU-based rendering on NVIDIA cards. And big winners again, those 4090s with the Dragon range coming out slightly ahead of the Core i9 13980HX. But interesting to me are those 14-inch laptops. They are basically half the performance of a 4090 laptop GPU, but yet again, right there, right in the rear view mirror of both those 3080 Ti's. One of those in a big laptop with the fans going full speed, RTX 3080 Ti with 175 watt TGP. It's amazing to think you could size down from a 6.5 pound laptop with a 3 pound power supply down to something that weighs 4 pounds or 3 pounds 11 ounces.
Very interesting indeed. But we're in the home stretch. We got one more test here, Gordon. We're going back to Cinebench. Well, what'd you do with Cinebench this time?
Well, this is a fun thing that I do. So by default, Cinebench R23 runs a 10-minute stress test. It basically renders a frame on all CPU cores for 10 minutes over and over and over again. Well, typically what happens on a laptop CPU that gets hotter, the clocks start to fall off as it heats up. That's usually what I've seen on Intel. That's just it's happened for quite a while now because Intel is on an older process. It just simply doesn't have the efficiency of, say, an AMD Ryzen 5 nanometer chip. So I run it on default 10-minute run, and then because I have a control of it, because it's Cinebench, I then run it a single time. So you can run it with the stress test off. It just renders one single frame. So that tells you 10-minute Cinebench run versus a very short Cinebench run. How much performance do you give up? Well, if you look at all those blue bars on Intel CPUs, you typically give up a decent amount of performance. This has been going on Intel for a while now because, again, you heat up Intel CPUs, they give up performance. Less so on a desktop because desktops have much, much better cooling. On a laptop, though, you don't have all your fancy liquid cooling and big-ass air coolers. And look at it, we're giving up 10.5% on the ZenBook Pro 14, on the GT77 with that Core i9 13980HX. You're giving, even though it's a giant laptop with the fans going, you're giving up again 10%. On the 13950HX, on that Razer Blade 16, you're giving up about 8%. And on the older Core i9 12900HX, again a desktop, you're giving up almost 11% performance. I've seen this with Intel for a long time, but I've never seen that on Mac because at the top of this is the MacBook Pro 16 with the M2 processor in there. You can run that thing 10 minutes, an hour. It just does not give up any performance because that chip runs so cool because of the efficiency, the power efficiency. It just doesn't heat up. And 10 minutes to one frame rendered, basically you're within the margin of error of it. And we are also seeing that now with the Razer Blade 14 with the Ryzen 9 7940HX because that is 0.24% difference. Basically, we're talking probably margin of error. So 10-minute to a single frame run, it basically is a testament to the efficiency of this new Phoenix CPU. And pretty impressive. And we're also, in fact, bonus, we also see that with Dragon Range. I mean, it's not quite as good because you're giving up about 1.5%, but that is very good.
That's still pretty damn close.
It's pretty damn close. Even though it's a desktop CPU being driven in a laptop, it is still a 5 nanometer chip, and they are managing the power far better than Intel has because, again, I've done this test many times on Intel CPUs, and you give up performance. Like, if you did a single run like on Cinebench R20, you would get 12% more performance. But with Cinebench R23, anything, and you could apply that to anything that's going to run the CPU all cores hard, you're going to at least give up 10% of performance generally.
Well, but if we bring the scores back and look at the actual scores, I would say it's even more impressive to know that ROG Strix Scar is not losing that much, whether it's a single run or a 10-minute loop. It's still turning in the highest performance here. Yeah. Really, even when it drops down 1.63%.
Yeah, I mean, again, has been an advantage AMD has. They have been on TSMC 5 nanometer. They're on 4 nanometer now for the Phoenix. So it pays dividends because they just run cooler. And to me, I would be interested to take this Razer Blade 14 and put it against a MacBook Pro 14, because I would say all of the trash talking Apple fans and Apple has done on Intel on power efficiency, you know what? They have a real point there. You could look at our MacBook versus Razer Blade 16 story, there is a real message to be made that, you give up performance on Intel on battery, and when you heat it up, I think if you put it against an AMD CPU, it's going to get a lot closer than people expect you.
Interesting. Maybe that is a test you should be doing. Yes,
Yeah, we
for
should
sure.
do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing the test that you did do. I appreciate it, and stepping through the results with me and all the fine folks out there. Thank you for watching. And yeah, if you have more ideas for Gordon to test with these laptops, put them down in the comments. Be sure to subscribe for more awesome PC hardware testing, and we will catch you later. Thanks.